Welcome back. This is the first lesson in the course, Basic Types of Counterplans, and this lesson is going to cover advantage counterplans. So, to discuss advantage counterplans, though, first requires a real understanding of counterplan competition. And if you've seen our course on introducing counterplans, this will be familiar, but it's still worthwhile to do a brief refresher. There are really two types of ways that a counterplan can compete: mutual exclusivity and competing on net benefits. Mutual exclusivity means that it is impossible to do both. They say increase, we say decrease. Really, polar opposite, you just cannot do both, it is impossible. But in contrast, competing based net benefit says it's possible to do both, but perhaps we shouldn't do both. So, for example, suppose I were to say the plan is that we will go to McDonald's for dinner, and you were to say counterplan, go to Wendy's instead during that same time slot. You just can't do both. 7 p.m., you cannot be in two places. But if it were to say, go to Wendy's maybe 5 hours later, it's possible to do both, but it might not be desirable to. Maybe that's just too much food, too much driving. Maybe you have an appointment later on that it's theoretically possible to do both, but it might not be desirable to. So how do advantage counterplans really fit within that matrix? So an advantage counterplan is a counterplan that is not mutually exclusive, but it solves the AF and avoids a disadvantage. Advantage counterplans are really the classic example of competing on net benefits. It is possible to do a permutation and do both, but there's no reason to, because the counterplan theoretically solves the entire AF, but it avoids the disadvantage. So you could do both, but the counterplan gets the benefits of the AF without the downsides. So it's the terminology. It's called an advantage counterplan because it is intended to be geared towards solving that advantage. So let's discuss some of the core features, and then we can give some examples to really illustrate some of this. So advantage counterplans compete based on net benefits, almost always. I can think of very few, if any, examples of advantage counterplans that are mutually exclusive. They also have an external net benefit, a disad in this case, as opposed to an internal net benefit. The bread and butter of the advantage counterplan 2 and R is our counterplan solves your advantage, but we avoid the external net benefit. We avoid this disadvantage. We solve the AF without incurring the harms that you're discussing. These also tend to be shorter. They will have few, if any, cards, and they will not really be the primary part of a negative strategy. So the advantage counterplan shell will probably be maybe a minute or less, maybe a little bit longer, but not much. And the 2 and R will not be spending a tremendous amount of time on this. It will instead function almost more as a case defensive argument. So some other features. One way of reading them often is to recut AF solvency or contention evidence and advocate those changes. So suppose your opponent has said, we should ban lethal autonomous weapons, and then they read a contention card that is about nuclear instability. You could maybe recut their impact card about nukes are going to kill us all and say counterplan, abolish nuclear weapons. You're then reading their own evidence against them, demonstrating there's no real intrinsic connection between the advocacy and their contentions. So people will call that recutting their cards, re-highlighting their cards, etc. But it's really using their evidence against them. The second is just to find a separate solvency advocate or a separate avenue to solve the AF. So in that same example about nuclear instability engendered from lethal autonomous weapons, you might say, whole new idea. A counterplan is to just have dialogue about this. Have conversations about some of the risks that are posed. Or perhaps the counterplan is arms control to reduce nuclear escalation risks. Advantage counterplans also often include multiple planks. Planks are basically various parts of the counterplan. So if your counterplan does 10 things, you might have 10 distinct planks that are all different things the counterplan does. So let's think about some non-debate examples as well as debate examples. So a non-debate example. Plan is to go to McDonald's. The advantage is that we're able to practice our driving skills. We're able to drive somewhere and become a better driver. The neg might say two things. The first, counterplan, let's drive to the mall instead. And second, disad, McDonald's has bad food. So the point with that counterplan is that it highlights the fact that the affirmative is not essential for capturing their own advantage. The advantage was just getting to practice their driving skills. You don't need to go to this restaurant to get those driving skills. Rather, this counterplan illustrates you can get those same driving skills just by driving somewhere different, driving to a mall, for example. But the reason why you can't just do both, drive to the mall and drive to the McDonald's, is that there is a downside to doing the plan that the counterplan uniquely avoids. The downside is that McDonald's has bad food. It's not worthwhile to go there. The counterplan avoids that by going somewhere entirely different. Now with a debate example. So the affirmative is banning lethal autonomous weapons, and the advantage is miscalculated war Killer robots are likely to cause misunderstandings and conflict. They increase the rate of conflict, etc. They're super scary, make war more likely. The neg might say counterplan, engage in dialogue and confidence-building measures. The U.S. should talk with other countries to figure out exactly what's going on with these robots, should figure out exactly that we're on the same page about the role they play in conflict. And then the disad is that we should not ban those weapons. We should keep them because developing them can have valuable spin-offs in terms of fostering innovation. So see the interplay of this. The affirmative has said there are bad things that can happen with robots, therefore ban them. The neg has said don't ban them, do something else to reduce the bad things. And the benefit of that is that we get some of the upside of having that technology. So advantage counterplans really are we fix the bad of the affirmative, but don't go so far as to miss some of the good. And the disad really captures why some of this technology can be used in good ways. So then advantage counterplans truly are just about doing what you can to solve the affirmative case while avoid doing the specific affirmative plan that will incur some bad side effects. So what are some ways the neg can effectively go for these positions? The most important thing is to focus on their arguments, not your own. Oftentimes the neg gets caught up in just making a bunch of reasons why the advantage counterplan is the best thing ever, has all these great side effects, etc., but they don't matter because the point of the advantage counterplan is not to just forward your own great advocacy. It is specifically about solving the affirmative case. So the counterplan needs to solve their specific advantage. So in this example we gave about, the plan is to go to McDonald's, the counterplan is go to the mall instead, solves your advantage about driving because you get to practice driving. If the neg were to say, going to the mall is great because we can also go to Build-A-Bear Workshop, that's not relevant. It's a solvency argument that doesn't solve an advantage the affirmative established. Solvency arguments must always be framed around the AF's specific advantages. The counterplan also does not need to solve as well as the affirmative, but just enough. So that's a distinction that might be confusing, so let's break that down. Suppose the affirmative says we need to avoid climate change, we need to reduce warming by, let's say, 10%. And then they say our advocacy reduces it by 35%. The counterplan, if it solves only 10%, it's not as good as the affirmative, but it still is sufficient because their own evidence for their contention said 10% is what's key. The affirmative might have gone over that, but it's not necessary. The part that's necessary is just 10%. So a counterplan might not be as good as the affirmative, but it still solves enough to solve the contention. This is known as sufficiency framing. You might hear someone say, view counterplan solvency through a lens of sufficiency, even if the counterplan does not solve as well as the affirmative. It solves enough to remedy their internal links. You also need to watch out for potential perm or net benefit complications. A common tactic in these situations is the AF will make arguments for counterplan links to the net benefit. They will say that not only does the AF link to the disad, but the counterplan does too. So you want to make sure that you're able to articulate very cleanly why the counterplan avoids the problem of the disad. And the same sort of goes in reverse with perm shields the link arguments. It's possible that the AF will say, look, the counterplan avoids the disadvantage so cleanly that doing the counterplan and the AF combined can reduce the disad. So, for example, can avoid the disad. So, for example, suppose the disad is something about the plan being super, super unpopular, and the counterplan is like, this counterplan's popular, so we avoid the disad. The AF might say, doing the plan and counterplan together creates an action that is so popular that it then avoids the disad. Let's talk about AF strategy then. The real strategy here is to collapse the debate down to a small set of advantages or scenarios to make the debate smaller. It's often possible to get overwhelmed by an advantage counterplan when there are a lot of different planks flying around, and as a result, the issue then becomes that you just miss something, or you don't really deal with the plank adequately. Making the debate smaller can be very useful, because then you can ignore planks that are relevant. If the neg has 10 planks, each one meant to solve one of your various scenarios in the AF, and you collapse down to just 2 scenarios, most of the counterplan might be gone, and you can really concentrate your fire on just a few small parts of the counterplan. You also should take advantage of counterplans that are sloppily written with too many planks. Oftentimes, if the neg has 10 planks, several of them might link to their own disad without them knowing it. So be thoughtful about making arguments that the counterplan links to the disad, or that the permutation can shield the link. The combination of the AF and the counterplan together, through a permutation, can avoid the disad. So the key really is to think about counterplans, advantage counterplans, as key defensive weapons. They mitigate parts of the AF case in lieu of the neg having to make defensive case arguments. These are not sources of offense, but they are a vital source of defense, and it's important to know how to go for them and answer them. Thank you for watching.